A tragedy like this didn't just take a life in this alternate timeline. It sent a shockwave through an entire movement that was already under strain. What followed wasn't unity or quiet reflection, it was fragmentation. Long-standing alliances cracked, private disagreements spilled into public view, and figures who once stood shoulder to shoulder suddenly found themselves speaking past each other, or not speaking at all. What's striking is that the most explosive fallout didn't happen in a courtroom or through official statements. It happened online, in podcasts, clipped interviews, quote tweets, and carefully worded posts. The conservative media world began turning inward. Grief mixed with suspicion. Silence was seen as strategy. Clarification sounded like deflections, and every attempt to calm the noise seemed to make it louder. Instead of focusing on legal timelines or formal proceedings, attention drifted toward personalities, motives, and what wasn't being said. Viewers weren't just watching a case unfold, they were watching a movement wrestle with itself in real time. Supporters split into camps, each convinced they were defending truth, while the other side was hiding it. And hovering over all of it were the gaps, the unanswered questions no one could quite resolve, the whispered theories passed along with disclaimers and raised eyebrows, and one phrase that refused to fade, no matter how often it was dismissed or explained away: the so-called Egyptian plane. For years, Candace Owens and Turning Point USA appeared to be moving in the same direction. Their messaging overlapped, their audiences blended, and their public appearances reinforced the idea of a shared mission. Even when disagreements surfaced, they stayed mostly behind the scenes, brushed off as differences in style rather than substance. From the outside, it looked solid, almost unshakable. During that time, Erika Kirk barely registered in the public conversation. She wasn't a regular voice in the media circuit, and she didn't command attention the way the movement's most recognizable figures did. But tragedy has a way of rearranging hierarchies. Almost overnight, Erika was no longer a background presence. She became central to the story, whether she wanted that role or not. In the weeks that followed, something felt off. Candace grew quieter about Turning Point, careful with her wording, absent from spaces where her voice used to be expected. There were no public call-outs, no dramatic statements, just distance. Erika, meanwhile, kept an unusually low profile, which only added to the sense that conversations were happening out of view. At first, most people chalked it up to grief. Silence was seen as respect. Separation looked like self-preservation. But beneath that surface calm, old trust was thinning. Small disagreements that once would have been smoothed over were left unresolved, and the emotional weight of loss quietly exposed cracks that had been forming for years. And that fragile quiet, it didn't hold, because silence didn't last forever. The shift didn't happen all at once. There was no single moment where Candace Owens openly broke ranks or declared a change in allegiance. Instead, it showed up in tone, in the way she started phrasing things, the pauses where certainty used to be. What once sounded like solidarity slowly took on the edge of skepticism. Candace framed her approach carefully. She wasn't, as she put it, accusing anyone. She was asking questions. Questions she suggested others were avoiding. Questions that, in her view, became more important when powerful organizations, political influence, and a public tragedy intersected. To her supporters, this didn't feel like betrayal. It felt like consistency. They believed she was doing what she had always claimed to do: challenge narratives, even when it made people uncomfortable. That audience quickly rallied behind the idea that accountability didn't disappear just because the moment was sensitive. In comment sections and reply threads, the same sentiment kept surfacing. Silence creates space for doubt. If official explanations were thin or delayed, then speculation was almost inevitable. And once those gaps occurred, the internet rushed in to fill them. Clips were slowed down, old interviews were rewatched, timelines were sketched out in threads that stretched for dozens of posts. None of it was presented as definitive proof, but the sheer volume gave it weight. The more questions that went unanswered, the more curiosity hardened into suspicion. And then, buried inside all that noise, one strange detail ignited everything. At first, it was just a phrase, dropped casually, almost cryptically, in the middle of longer conversations. No explanation attached, no names directly linked to it. Just two words that sounded out of place enough to make people stop scrolling. The Egyptian plane. Within days, the phrase began circulating on its own. Short clips were pulled from longer podcasts. Screenshots of timestamps started popping up. People pointed to travel windows, blurred flight paths, and vague references to aircraft without ever fully connecting the dots. The lack of clarity was part of the appeal. It felt like something half-hidden, something you had to piece together yourself. What made the theory spread wasn't certainty, but ambiguity. Locations didn't quite line up. Dates overlapped in confusing ways. Mentions of unnamed entities, military, government-linked, or otherwise, hovered in the background without ever being explicitly defined. Every version of the story came with disclaimers, but the questions lingered anyway. Importantly, no direct accusation was laid at anyone's feet. Candace and those amplifying the discussion were careful with wording. It was framed as implication, not indictment. A suggestion that something existed in the shadows, not a claim that anyone specific was responsible. That distinction mattered, at least to those making the argument. Still, the phrase took on a life of its own. And once it reached that point, staying silent was no longer an option, because that's when Erika finally spoke. Erika Kirk eventually stepped into the spotlight during a nationally televised CBS town hall, a setting that made it clear she wasn't just speaking to critics online, but to a much wider audience. Calm and composed, she addressed the swirling narratives head-on, acknowledging the rumors while making it clear she believed they were spiraling out of control. Her message was direct. Speculation, even when framed as just questions, could have real consequences. She focused heavily on timelines, pointing out that many of the dates and movements being circulated simply didn't align with reality. According to her, the online theories stitched together unrelated moments and turned coincidence into suspicion. She also explained her prolonged absence from public view, saying it was intentional and deeply personal. Stepping back, she claimed, was the only way to protect herself and her family during an already unbearable period. There was an emotional weight to her words that went beyond facts and clarifications. Erika spoke about the cost of seeing private grief dissected in public spaces, about the strain of watching strangers debate her life as if it were a puzzle to be solved. Even as she tried to remain measured, the toll was visible, underscoring how deeply the speculation had cut. Her goal seemed clear: draw a line, close the door on the rumors, and redirect attention away from theories she believed were baseless. But the explanation didn't land the way she hoped, because while Erika saw closure, Candace saw avoidance, and Candace wasn't convinced. Candace didn't wait long to respond. Shortly after the town hall clip began circulating, she took to X with a sharp rebuttal, accusing Erika of answering a claim that, in her words, was never actually made. From Candace's perspective, the response felt like a deflection, a way to knock down an easier argument while sidestepping the uncomfortable question at the center of the debate. She was careful to draw a clear boundary. Candace insisted she had never accused the Kirk family of anything, nor suggested personal involvement in any wrongdoing. Repeating that point became central to her pushback. The issue, she argued, wasn't about individuals, but about systems, movements, and unanswered anomalies that appeared whenever power and politics intersected with tragedy, hinting that the aircraft being discussed could have been connected to military or government-linked operations. It was a subtle pivot, one that moved the conversation away from family members and toward unnamed institutions. Again, it was presented as a possibility, not a claim, but it widened the scope of speculation even further. Critics were quick to seize on weaknesses in her argument. Some pointed out inconsistencies in the timeline she referenced. Others highlighted confusion over time zones and flight windows, arguing that these errors undermined her credibility. To them, the questions weren't brave, they were careless. But the pushback didn't slow anything down. If anything, it hardened positions on both sides. Supporters doubled down, critics dug in, and the space for nuance shrank even further, because that criticism only made the divide wider. What started as a disagreement between two prominent voices quickly spread outward, pulling the broader conservative media world into the fallout. Audiences that once overlapped began to fracture, sorting themselves into camps based not just on loyalty, but on how they believed power should be challenged. Lines were drawn in comment sections, live stream chats, and reaction videos, often with little room left for middle ground. To one side, Candace was fearless, a figure willing to risk backlash by pressing on questions others avoided. Her supporters argued that movements only rot when no one dares to challenge them from within. To the other side, she was reckless, someone turning grief into spectacle and feeding unproven narratives for engagement. In their view, curiosity without restraint wasn't courage, it was chaos. Erika, meanwhile, was framed in two very different ways depending on who you asked. Supporters saw her as trying to protect legal integrity, worried that unchecked speculation could poison juries and derail due process. Critics, however, accused her of attempting to control the narrative, deciding which questions were acceptable and which crossed an invisible line. Lost in the middle was the tragedy itself. Clips were monetized, reactions were stitched together for maximum reach. Every new statement became fuel for another round of commentary. What had once been a moment of collective mourning slowly transformed into a content cycle, where outrage and curiosity proved far more durable than closure. And while the online arguments kept escalating, the real-world process didn't pause. Meanwhile, the case itself moved forward. In this alternate timeline, a suspect had been formally named and court dates were looming. While the trial was set to determine what actually happened, much of the public conversation had already moved far beyond the courtroom walls. For many, the drama was no longer about evidence or testimony. It was about interpretation, rumor, and who could shape the story first. Erika used every platform available to stress the potential consequences of unchecked speculation. She warned that jury contamination was a very real risk if theories and conjecture continued to dominate social media feeds. She also spoke candidly about the emotional toll, the strain of seeing a tragedy replayed endlessly online, the anxiety of being scrutinized at every turn, and the pressure of trying to maintain composure while the world debated her every move. Yet despite official statements, timelines, and repeated clarifications, the speculation refused to die. Clips resurfaced, threads were rekindled, and new insights were offered as though no facts had been established at all. The internet had taken on a life of its own, turning curiosity and concern into a persistent, self-perpetuating storm. Beneath all the digital noise, however, the human cost was undeniable. Relationships frayed, trust eroded, and private grief became public fodder. For those directly involved, every comment, every theory, every viral clip was a reminder that the tragedy could not simply be processed and set aside. It would be lived again and again, in real time, on screens everywhere. And that leads to the bigger question. When grief, power, and influence collide, the results are rarely neat or contained. In this case, a movement once defined by clear messaging and aligned voices became a tangled web of speculation, rivalry, and unspoken tensions. Influence, it seems, has no brakes. Once momentum builds, it's nearly impossible to slow, and the consequences ripple far beyond the original incident. The story also forces a difficult question. Does the act of asking questions have a limit? At what point does curiosity cross into recklessness, and when does accountability turn into amplification of rumor? For those watching from the outside, the line is blurry, and for those living it, the consequences are immediate and deeply personal. There is no tidy resolution here, no clear winner or definitive answer. The fractures remain, the debates continue, and the online chatter persists, leaving viewers to wrestle with the uncertainty themselves. Some theories linger not because they are true, but because the spaces left by silence, grief, and avoidance allow them to grow, quietly embedding themselves into the narrative. And sometimes the questions that remain unanswered are the ones that shape the story the most.